Hey, what's going on? My name's Robert, and you are watching Southpaw Auto Works. So we're back on the 55 Bel Air. In the last episode, the transmission was dropped down and out of the vehicle, and it was opened up. All of that was done with the intent of conducting a basic repair. It was our goal and our hope to get everything all buttoned up, all in one run, all in one day. Unfortunately, some setbacks were encountered, so here we are on episode number 2. Speaking of episodes, if you're interested or you missed episode number 1, you can find a shortcut to that in the video description down below. So back to today. We're definitely more prepared and we're ready to get after it. So without further ado, let's get the show on the road. All right, we're rolling.
Rolling, all right. We're back on our pump job here for the 55 Chevy. What we've opted to do is replace this pump body. We had a leak around that front seal, and it looks as if someone's gotten a little carried away with drilling the drain back hole there and maybe damaged that seal surface. So we've got another pump body. I'm going to show you how to set that up and do it just like we would do it if we were building the unit from scratch. First thing we're going to do is just that drain back hole on the pump body right here. That's one thing we always enlarge on these 700s, 4L60s, 4L60Es. The reason is from the factory that hole was too small, created a real issue with these leaking out the front. What happens is the oil pressure as it builds in the pump body here, sneaks past the pump bushing, comes up here, lubricates that front seal, and then that's its escape route right there, or drain back hole. This one looks like it may have already been drilled out slightly from factory size. We're going to go even bigger. I'm going to show you how we do that. That prevents too much oil once again from building up, trying to push that front seal out the front of the trans. What I use anyway, is a 5/16 drill bit, extra long. Some of the pumps that we drill have a very long passage to drill through, so we get that guy, and what we're going to do is just follow the original hole down in the pump itself, drilling all the way down till it breaks into the other side of the pump there, not through the pump. Be aware when this gets to the bottom, a lot of times it does catch and that pump's going to want to try and twist out of your hand. So check our progress here by looking down through the connecting hole there. There it is. I think we bottomed out. Run it down in there so I can see it down through the other passage, which would be this guy right here. What I'm going to do now is take the drill bit out, go back in just slightly, and I'm going to open up that top end of that hole where it comes right into the pump body itself. Looks a little crude sometimes, but what happens is when you get this assembled and you've got your new bushing in the pocket here, and then you press your new front seal in, the seal can actually come down and start to block off that passage itself. So if we bell mouth that or open it up a little bit, more chance for the oil to escape and get out of there. Okay, now we go to the opposite side. What's kind of funny on this is a lot of times they've already drilled this hole a little bit larger. Didn't really have to do any work there. They drill this one large, but they don't drill the other half of the passage large. So now what I'm going to do is change out to a countersink. It's something I like to do on all these pumps. And what we're going to do is just touch the top of that hole there to remove any of the sharp edges. Just give that little touch right there. Clean it up so that we haven't pushed that above the surface, creating an issue. And then I believe Our original stator was already drilled. We need to check the hole in there. The corresponding hole on this half of the stator is going to be right here. And I believe that half is already drilled to my larger size and countersunk once again. So just to give you an idea, I brought another stator here we can take a look at. And there's our corresponding hole. You see how small that one is compared to what we've drilled out over here. So let's get this guy out of the way for now. So what we've got to do is build the pump body back up with all the components. First thing we got to do is get some of the junk out of there. Make sure we don't have any of the shavings hanging around in there. We've got to put a new bushing in this pump body. We've got an improved pump bushing over what was in the other pump. This was probably a Babbitt or Steelback Babbitt or bronze bushing that was in here. What we're going to go with is the later bushing, which is actually like a Teflon coated PTFE, I believe they call it. It's got just like a frying pan or whatever kind of no stick surface on it, but makes for an excellent bushing surface they're finding out these days. So we'll upgrade to that. We don't have a press, arbor press here available readily other than a hydraulic press, so we're just going to knock these bushings in. I've got a couple of drivers, 2 different sizes, one that'll fit the bushing exact. I start with an oversized one first, and I drive it in until it stops or press it in. That way I figure the bushing is in fairly straight to start with. That's the reason for the oversized one. And then we'll take the one that fits the bushing a little more exact. We're going to drive in. Now be aware on a lot of your 700s, 4L60s and so forth, there is a lip. You always want to drive the bushing from the inside towards the outside on the installation. And you can drive the bushing until it stops. Do not keep going, especially if you're using a press or large hammer, you will damage that. There is kind of a little stopping or step there for you. So we'll knock that in, and feels like it stopped. Yep, we should be good right there. Now what we're going to do is a little trial fit on this. What I use is converter hubs that I have cut off from the converter manufacturers, and I fit them in there to make sure it's in there straight. There's no issues with the bushing, but we've got our converter hub to use. So what we'll do is set that over the converter hub. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift this hub, or the pump body, up on the hub, right up to that area right there. I'm lifting up lightly with one finger, and then we're going to take the end of the hammer handle, give her a little smack. Okay? I would do the same thing if I had that converter hub. I would install it in here, and I would use the edge of the hammer and give it a little smack. And what we're doing is just fitting the bushing to that hub itself. I do it on most all my bushings. Make sure it's smooth and free on there. We've got a nice tight fit, and that'll knock down any high spots that may be on that bushing. So next we want to put in the front seal. Once again, I'd prefer to press this in, but I don't have an arbor press available, and a hydraulic press is going to be a little too cumbersome to work with just to put in a front seal. So I like to use a little sealer around the outer edge. If you're not aware, this color on your seals, that is actually supposed to be a sealer to help seal between this surface and what you're driving it into. But in the business, we like to usually add a little extra around the outer edge. Silicone, RTV, whatever the case may be, or the anaerobic sealer. We'll add just a little extra on there. That way, if we've got any little scratches, little boogers, which we got a few on here, we'll hopefully fill those in with that sealer and not create an issue. that guy on there. Start a little crooked. Here we go. Like we're down all the way around there. There's some of that extra sealer there. Okay, now we got to build up the pump body. What we're going to use for our stand for this to make it a little easier is that. What we want to start with, a little bit of transmission fluid in this pump body, in the pocket itself as an assembly aid. Keep it lubed up for the initial startup. So what we've got to do is swap over our pump slide here into the other pump body. First thing we've got to do is get the big spring here out of place. Take that out. Should be able to lift this slide up and out of there. Now be aware, bottom side, we've got an O-ring seal here, and then a metal ring goes on there. While we're here, we're going to go ahead and replace that with a fresh one. And that just drops in that little groove or pocket right there. Put your metal ring on there, flip it over, put it in another pump body. Now we've got a couple other things we've got to swap over at the same time. Nice to have a little assembly lube, which I forgot to bring. Try and get this to stick in there, because every time you flip it, it's going to want to pop back out of there. So we've got to be quick. Or there, I think we got that time. So look at that. The assistant brought us some assembly lube. He's all right. Now, other things we got to swap over is this little pin right here, little pivot pin. I want to look at this real close. It's got a little bit of wear on the edge of that I was suspecting. So I brought a new pin, but here's the one that always gets lost. Excuse me. There's a spring down in the pocket underneath that pin. Be aware of that when you flip this over. That little guy, don't lose him. You're gonna take that guy and drop him down in that pocket right there.
Can I hold this for a second?
That guy right there.
Continue.
And so we've got the pin with the little tit on the end there. It's got to go down into that spring. Before we put that in there, what we want to do is put our seal and our little rubbing block on the opposite side of that first. So the little rubber expander goes against the slide, and then that seal goes in just like that. I like to put those in first, and then what I do is take the screwdriver, push over against that seal, and get that pin to drop in there. Just like that. And you can see that is spring loaded. It'll want to push up, that's normal. When you bolt the two halves of the pump together, it'll just simply push that down in place. Next thing we want to do is put our slide spring back in. Okay, put these in. What I usually do is a pair of channel locks opened up to about the same width of the pocket that you're going to install them into. The key here is just obviously to try and get them in here straight so they don't fly out on you. If we get those compressed just far enough and we're fast enough, we can push those in just like that, right into that pocket. Simple as that. Next step, and we need one of our pump rings in the pocket there. Then we get our rotor. Now the rotor is directional, and that's pretty easy to figure out because we've got a little plastic rotor guide that goes in here. And we've got to lock that into place, lining up all the little notches on there. So a little bit of assembly lube or light grease stuck underneath there. Put that guy in place. And then we simply flip that over and set that on top of that first ring. Make sure it drops all the way down. Now what we do is start sliding in all of our pump vanes, making sure that they get dropped all the way in the pocket and don't get caught on that lower ring, which is common. And sometimes we just got to work them around a little bit until they drop in place. And when we get all these guys in, we put our other ring on top. Now this being a 10 vane pump, because there are 10 vanes, some of the earlier 700s only had 7 vanes. Either one works fine. And when you get into your later 4L60Es, they went up to 13 vanes. So exact same setup, just a different number of vanes. Our second ring sets on top, make sure that drops all the way in, and then make sure that she rotates freely, meaning that all these vanes are sliding in and out of the rotor properly, no binding. And then what we want to do is finish that off with additional fluid. We put enough fluid in here to where it's probably going to run out on us as we're assembling the pump halves and putting it back in the pump, but we want it literally just like you just shut the car off and it's still got fluid in it for our restart, so nothing is dry. Now, next, I give that little push there, no big deal. We've got to line up our pump half, other pump half stator support. What I'm looking for here is either lining up pump bolts, or I just come over and look for my drain back hole that we drilled out in our original drain back hole here. Slide her over and get that lined up. Now I'm gonna push down on that a little bit against the pump body, and I do this number. Slide it back and forth a few times. The reason for that is just in case there's a little something on the surface of the pump or the stator, we make sure and kind of knock that down, or maybe we got a little burr or something sticking up. Put in our 5 pump bolts. We do not want to tighten those down yet. We're just going to run them down with the light gun or finger. And then what we want to do before we finish torquing is align these 2 pump halves with a strap. And you've got options there. I've seen people put the pump back in the case, in an empty case sometimes, and tighten them down that way if you don't have a strap. But you've got a couple options there. You can buy the actual strap that they make for this, a one-piece kind of deal, and that's going to slide right over both halves. Get that lined up. And then we tighten down that nut there to pull those 2 halves together, or align them. Before I tighten anything down, I'll also look down through the bolt holes and rotate it slightly if necessary to align those. And then we'll torque it. The other option you have, plumbing hardware supply store, buy a couple of the real large straps and just hook them together. They'll work just as good. Nowadays with the internet, and I'm sure Robert can source any of that stuff for you and show you where to get it.
Well, I guess it's as good a time as any. If you're looking for 700 R4 parts, tools, and or supplies, be sure and check out the resources section in the video description down below.
So we run these bolts down, double check everything, finish tightening up our strap over here to hold the 2 halves aligned. Yeah. Maybe get one more turn. Okay, and then I brought a torque wrench. On these I use 18 foot-pounds. It's kind of a universal for me that I use that on a lot of different pumps. And of course what we're going to do is run in kind of a star pattern and work our way around. Let me just get these run down first to where they're kind of snug. Okay, so we'll do this number and then we'll jump around the pump a little bit. And then I go around one more time just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And we've got to put our thrust washer back on this stator here. It's just got the 2 little holes, 2 tabs to line up. I'm going to stick that in place so she doesn't come off on us when we put our pump back in there. If I can see them. And then our sealing rings right here, which are a lap type sealing ring. They're not a solid like the later 4060Es. We want to make sure that those don't come apart on us, so we're going to stick a little assembly goo on there too. Just kind of stick them back in place in their grooves. There. Now we'll get the strap off the pump and put a new O-ring around the pump body, a new gasket on there, and we'll be ready to set our pump back in there. So we got our pump back together. What I'd like to do is a little trial fit, just like we did on the pump body, but as it is fully assembled. And just make sure that she rotates okay and drop it all the way down. That's the point where you're engaged on that rotor itself. We know she works nice and smooth. We need a new pump O-ring on the body. Put that guy on there. Just so you know, paint side out on that. Paint stripe goes out. And a new pump gasket. What we're gonna do is take a little bit of our assembly goo. Try and get her down in here. And we'll stick the gasket in place on the case itself. Line up pump bolts and everything. Get that lined up as best we can. And then we're going to lube the O-ring on the pump body and then also the case. Excuse me. And with the angle that we've got the trans sitting at on the jack, we should be pretty good shape to get that pump back in. Ultimate would be to have it stand straight up, but we've checked our input shaft and drum here, make sure that we're still in place, and do the old drop test. Pull up on it slightly, drop it back down. Nice solid sound so we know we're not sitting on top of any of the clutches. With my gasket again. Okay, we'll flip this pump up in there, see if we can get it lined up. All right, now we've got to do a visual, see if we're close enough on the bolt holes. Might have to rotate a little bit. Too bad. I think we've got it pretty close. We'll try and start a couple of bolts through there. See where we're at. Yeah. We've got a couple started just to kind of get us aligned, but what we're going to do is on our pump bolts, if Robert wants to come back over here, we've got O-rings on each of the pump bolts that help seal the head of the bolt to the case. And there's two different styles on this, by the way. I don't know if I have, yeah, here's the other ones. Depending on early or late model, they're either going to use a washer on the head of the bolt or an O-ring. In this case, we know it takes O-rings because there's a groove cut into the head of the bolt. If it's smooth or flat right there, it's going to take the pump bolt washers instead. So I like to put fresh O-rings on each one of those. And then we're also going to put a drop of Loctite on each of the threads. So we'll change those out. And like I said, a little bit of Loctite. We've got to pull those other two pump bolts out, yet change the O-rings on those. If we got any Loctite left in here. I'm just using the blue, the medium grade Loctite on these. Okay, we'll take these other two that we stuck in there out, change the O-rings. So what I usually do is hammer handle to try and knock the pump back in. Find a socket to fit it. Ah, fell into my torque wrench. Now, I'm going to torque these same as I did the pump halves, 18 foot-pounds. Excuse me. Just going to get them all snugged up here first. And then we're going to go over them each one more time just to make sure I didn't miss them. Now, make sure our input shaft still turns okay. I don't have a good enough pair of pliers here right now to grab that input shaft, but if she turns by hand, we should be good shape. Also, just a side note, if you happen to have pulled off the lockup O-ring, make sure and put that back on again. We did not take that off disassembly. So, all right, we got our pump buttoned up back in there. We're ready to put our torque converter in and do reinstallation back in the car. So we're going to tip this back up fairly level. And nice if you can drain most of the fluid out of the torque converter first, but it's going to be a little messy on installation because I did not drain this all out. But we'll maintain as much of the fluid that we had this before, which is a good thing. Keep it as full as possible. If you're putting a new torque converter in, always dump at least a quart of fluid down in the converter first before you install it. More the better. So we'll be a little messy here, probably going back together. If there's not that much fluid in the torque converter, sometimes you can tip it up slowly and get it to drain down to the other half of the torque converter, save you a little bit of mess. This is pretty full, so I think no matter what, we're gonna make a mess. All right, so now comes the tricky part, trying to get the converter engaged all the way into the pump, which is the most critical thing for reinstallation. I usually just tend to work it like this with my two thumbs. You've got to get input shaft splines, stator splines, and engaged into the pump rotor.
We did previously put together a video on how to install a torque converter into an automatic transmission. You can find a shortcut to that video in the video description down below.
If we don't get her in all the way, then we do major damage on installation. I think we may have got her all the way. I'm going to give it a couple of more spins while I lift and turn. I think we got her all the way. Probably the biggest mistake most people make is damaging this converter or the pump by not getting this installed all the way. When we go to bolt this up to the engine, I'm going to show you how to make sure that you know the converter's in all the way, engaged into the pump, so that we do not do damage. Next step is we'll get her set up in there. Oh, and the other thing we want to do too is show you how to do the linkage seal on this while we've got it out of the vehicle. We've got to get this little adapter off of here for his shifter. Well, it looked like it was already loose. Oh, that's just a shaft moving. Okay. Uh-oh. All right. I don't know what size that is, but so we wanted to show you how to do the linkage seal. I did notice it was leaking on this. We've got to get his little adapter out of here. We had to find the right size socket. They've modified the nut that holds this down to a different size. I'll pull that linkage off. We made a mark on this guy earlier when we removed it, so we're hoping to keep that line back up again. So we have the advantage here of using the tool to extract that linkage seal without having to pull the pan, pull the shaft out and everything. And this cool little tool right here, all we got to do is thread that in, put a wrench on there. All right. Give it a few love taps and get it to grab that seal. It locks on there. Need this guy back. Kind of like a pump puller kind of thing, and then you thread the bolt in. Smacked on that too many times. And we just run the bolt in. That yanks that seal right out for us. Grabs a hold of it right on the end of that tool that's kind of threaded to grab it. Okay. And then this is our installation tool here that'll slide over to knock the new seal in. Excuse me. What did I do with the new seal? There it is. So, put a little grease or assembly lube on there. Ooh, that guy. Open side of the seal faces in towards the transmission. And a note on this, when you go to install it, there are two flats on that shaft, and you've got to work the seal over those. Do not just force it in place. I take a pocket screwdriver and I go in and I kind of work that seal a little bit, or the lip of the seal. I was like one of the GoPros was quitting. And I try and work it over those two flats instead of forcing it. So hopefully we don't cut the lip of the seal. We've got her started. Just take the installation tool. Looks like we're not bottomed all the way. There she is. Simple as that. That saved us from having to remove the pan and remove the shaft just to put that linkage seal in there. So we get our little adapter back on there. And whatever I did with the nut for it.
Right below the leg.
Right below the leg and fall down too. Yeah. Okay. Get that back in there. We'll get that tightened up. Then we should be ready to reinstall this back in the car. There we go. Okay, we're ready to go back in the car. Cool. Computers. Back in there. It's ready. All right, so we wanted to show you a little more detail on how to hook up this throttle pressure cable rather with the Then with the transmission installed in the vehicle, it's kind of hard to see. So if we've still got our link here in the trans, what I usually do is pull up on that with a pair of needle nose pliers, and then you're going to take your cable and you can see your loop right there to connect into, get that to slide over, and then that whole assembly is going to slide up into this housing, and then cable goes down into the grommet inside of the trans. I didn't put any lube on there, and of course we'll bolt it down. But that would be done in the vehicle, of course, once the trans is installed up against the engine. We just wanted to be able to show that detail as that comes on and off. Such as that. It's a little old and slow like me. So just to show you what we're doing here with reinstallation of our lockup solenoid, as we install that in from the bottom of the pan back up into the pump, where we would actually be installing that into is this passageway right here, which is the lockup valve train. When that's bolted in place from underneath, it would look kind of like that. We'd put the solenoid in, put the two bolts in, and then slide up in here, and this is our lockup valve train for the lock. That's the guy we needed to pull out, along with the filter, which went into the hole next to it, because otherwise we pull the pump out, we break the snout on this end or the filter. Oh, he's siliconed it. Well, he put the gasket on there.
Yeah, get her started.
If you don't mind. Okay, so we wanted to show you on torque converter installation. We made sure as we were bolting the bell housing or moving the bell housing of the trans up to the engine that our torque converter remained free and was spinning freely here. That assures us that we know we're all the way in. The pump itself, we should have to draw the torque converter towards the flywheel or flex plate as we install.
Like Andy said, the converter will be drawn up against the flex plate as those converter bolts are being installed. However, we forgot to mention, prior to installing those converter bolts, this would be a good time to check converter end play. I'm not going to go into any details on this, but I will say that converter end play is critical. How critical? Well, it's one of those things that if it's overlooked and it happens to be adjusted incorrectly, that it could result in premature transmission failure. To back up, that video I mentioned earlier about how to install a torque converter into an automatic transmission, In that same video, we covered converter and play. So like always, you can find a shortcut to that video in the video description down below.
We should have to draw the torque converter towards the flywheel or flex plate as we install. So we're free to do that and free to line it up. Be aware there sometimes are two different bolt patterns on the flywheel or flex plate, not a big deal. We're using, I believe, what would be the smaller diameter pattern here, so I can freely rotate the converter around. And what I'm going to do is put a drop of blue Loctite on each of these guys also, just to make sure they don't back out on us. So we'll get one of them started, get her lined up. And what I'm going to do is run that in most of the way, but not all. And we're going to leave that loose. Hopefully got just enough movement in that. So what we'll do now is rotate the engine over. We've got the cool flywheel tool to help us do that. Hook that in there. What I like to do is rotate around, get all three bolts in, get them all started, and then go back and lock them down. Makes it easier to line them up, usually. Let's get a little Loctite on there. Cool. If this were a Ford product, torque converter is going to have some studs sticking out of it instead of just these flat pads where the bolt comes in from the other side. So as we were to move this forward against the engine, we have to make sure and align the converter at that time. We don't have the luxury of doing it afterwards. We've got to align the studs on the converter with the holes in the flywheel or flex plate as it's installed, otherwise we do damage. So we'll get number 2 in there, move on to 3. Number of torque converter bolts does vary according to application, especially when you get in the larger V8s and diesels. They'll go as many as 6 bolts in the torque converter. So that allows me to move that converter just enough to get those started, make sure they're straight, and we don't screw up any threads. Now what we can do is torque that bolt down, cinch it up good and tight, rotate it around, finish the other 2, and we're good to go. Good. All right, back from our road test, 55 Bel Air. She drove out nice, shift points were good, trans is working great. We've got no trail of transmission fluid behind us, which is a good sign. And the fuel injection system is still kind of in a learning curve, I think, right now. We had some issues with it kind of wanting to backfire on us a few times and maybe try and stall out or whatever, but the engine and the fuel injection system are real low miles, so they're still learning. And but the main thing was we wanted to make sure that she performed well as far as transmission, shift points, lock-up, clutch application was good, and we're real happy with the way it came out. I think Kenny is also, and we'll do one more check for leaks, check fluid level and condition, and I think she's ready for 100,000 miles of trouble-free motoring.
This show is a ton of hours to produce, and we could use your support. You can learn more by checking out the video description down below. Speaking of support, a big thank you to both Kenny Sr. and Kenny Jr., both for their hospitality. They opened their doors to us and got us into their shop, and they got us behind the wheel of this sweet classic ride. If you're new here to the channel and you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell too, so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. We've got a lot more in store for you, so don't go anywhere. Catch you next time.